The paper tears in half, right between the two names signed in the same ink. A hand holds it close to the lamp, the edges trembling, and for a fleeting moment, the fireplace's glow illuminates it enough to read the letters before the fingers finally decide to fold it again instead of finishing the tear. Outside, the wind rattles the wooden shutters. Inside, someone holds their breath as if the paper could hear it. Caleb Whitfield hadn't planned on becoming a husband that winter. He was 29, his hands calloused from 8 years behind a plow, and he had a farm on the outskirts of Millbrook Hollow that he'd inherited from a father who'd left him more silence than words. He was a man of routine, rising before the sun, speaking little, and measuring the value of a day by how much work he'd managed to finish before dark. He had no time for courtship, nor patience for town meetings where mothers displayed their daughters like prized livestock. What he did have, instead, was a debt to the regional bank that was due in March, and a clause in his father's will stating with almost bureaucratic cruelty that the farm could only be inherited in full if Caleb was married before he turned 30. There was no love in that equation, only arithmetic. And arithmetic, at that point in his life, was the only thing Caleb trusted. Elena Marsh arrived in Millbrook Hollow in a rented carriage, with 2 trunks and a letter from her great-aunt inviting her to stay for as long as the heart needs. A phrase Elena understood, painfully, as, for as long as you have nowhere else to go. She was 26 and carried a history that the folks in the eastern town whispered about behind her back. A broken engagement, a scandal that wasn't entirely hers, but she carried as if it were. And a father who had decided a daughter without a husband was a daughter without value. She didn't cry in public. She had learned over the past 2 years that tears were a luxury those with reputations to rebuild couldn't afford. When Elena's great-aunt died that spring, leaving behind only debts and a house the bank would claim within weeks, Elena found herself with a choice that wasn't really a choice. Return to her father's home, where a silence worse than any insult awaited her, or find another way to stand on her own 2 feet. It was Reverend Holt who brought them together, not out of romance, but out of necessity. He knew Caleb's situation, he knew Elena's, and he knew, above all, that they were both honest people caught in dishonest circumstances. "I'm not asking you to love each other," he told them that afternoon, sitting between them in his small study that smelled of wax and old paper. "I'm asking you to help each other. There's a difference, and you both know it." The arrangement was simple, almost cold in its clarity. A marriage on paper. Caleb would keep the farm. Elena would have a roof over her head, a last name to shield her from the town's judgment, and the dignity of not having to return to a house that had never wanted her back. They would sleep in separate rooms. They would share meals, work, and nothing more. It would be, they both said quietly, a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Elena signed the paper without looking up. Caleb signed beneath her, his name jagged from the haste of finishing something that felt, though neither would say it aloud, like a surrender disguised as a solution. The first months have the texture of 2 strangers sharing a house too small for so much silence. Elena cooked, Caleb ate without comment, which she learned, over time, to interpret not as indifference, but as a kind of man who didn't know how to name what he appreciated. Caleb repaired the garden fence without being asked. Elena never thanked him with words, but she started leaving him the best portion of meat on his plate. A gesture so small, neither of them could have explained it if asked. There was a routine between them that wasn't on any signed paper. He split the firewood before she woke up so the house would be warm when she came down. She left freshly brewed coffee on the table before he returned from the stable, still steaming, as if she'd calculated the exact minute of his footsteps. Neither of them called it care. They called it, if anything, what you do when you live under the same roof. But there were moments, and this was what neither of them would ever confess, when the silence between them stopped feeling empty and started feeling full. One night, as Elena mended a shirt of Caleb's by the fire, he watched her from the doorway longer than he'd intended. And when she looked up and caught him staring, neither of them looked away immediately. It was a second, maybe two, but a second, in a house where nothing was said aloud, weighed like an hour. "Do you need something?" she asked, and her voice trembled in a way neither of them recognized as nervousness. "Not yet." "No," Caleb said. "I was just thinking that shirt has never looked so well sewn." It was a small, clumsy lie. The shirt was sewn just as it always was. But Elena smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Millbrook Hollow, she felt seen. Not for her situation, not for her scandal, not for her need, for her. But what neither of them knew yet was that that kind of look, once it happens, can't be unlearned. September brought the harvest, and with it, Thomas Hargrove, son of the owner of the region's largest mill, a man of soft hands and polished words, who had decided, with the carefree certainty of someone who has never been rejected, that Elena Marsh would be his wife. He didn't know, because Elena and Caleb had taken care that no one knew for sure, that Elena's marriage was on paper, not in heart. What he did know was that he found her beautiful, capable, and available in the way some men measure availability, by the visible absence of affection in a marriage. "Your husband barely looks at you in church," Thomas told her one Sunday in the chapel yard, with the confidence of someone who believes he's being observant rather than cruel. "A woman like you deserves someone who looks at her." Elena didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, something shifted within her that she hadn't expected. Not attraction to Thomas, but a fierce protection towards something that didn't yet have a name. Something that happened in her kitchen every morning over steaming coffee. Something that lived in the seconds when Caleb looked at her longer than necessary. Caleb, who had been watching the scene from afar while hitching the wagon, felt something he also couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself. It was simply the discomfort of seeing a man speak to his wife with such familiarity. Just that. He repeated that lie all the way back to the farm, and he repeated it again that night as he split firewood in the dark long after the necessary work was done. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the unbearable tension we feel when our actions contradict the image we have of ourselves. Caleb had convinced himself he was a practical man, governed by arithmetic and not by feeling. Yet there he was, outside, in the cold, splitting wood he didn't need to split, just so he wouldn't have to sit across from Elena and discover what her face might reveal. Thomas didn't give up after a single conversation. He started appearing at the market on days he knew Elena would be buying provisions. He offered, in front of half a dozen neighbors who missed no detail, to take her to the next county fair, since your husband, I understand, prefers to stay with his fields rather than his company. The comment, calculated to hurt, reached Caleb's ears before the afternoon was over, as such things always do in small towns. Distorted, exaggerated, and with enough truth embedded to sting. That night, Caleb said nothing at dinner. He ate in silence, faster than usual, and got up before Elena had finished her plate. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Because even in a marriage of paper, two people who live together for months learn to read each other's weather. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, and he regretted the harshness the moment the words left his mouth. But he was already at the door, and pride, that old enemy of quiet men, wouldn't let him turn back. Elena remained seated at the table long after her plate had grown cold, wondering for the first time in months if what she felt for Caleb's silence was simply habit, or something that hurt in a new way. The farm's debt, the real one, the bank's, not the metaphorical one, came to a head in October. The regional banker, a man named Pruitt, who measured compassion in compound interest, informed Caleb that the final deadline to settle his father's loan would be moved up if he couldn't demonstrate before the board of directors that the farm was generating sufficient, stable income to guarantee payment. That meant one thing. The fall harvest had to be perfect, sold in its entirety, with no losses from weather or market. And then the early frost arrived. It fell one night without warning, freezing half an acre of the wheat fields that Caleb had literally counted on to pay off the debt. When he went out that morning and saw the damage, something in his face broke in a way Elena had never seen. It wasn't the calm face of the man who split firewood without complaint. It was the face of someone who saw, with unbearable clarity, that he could lose everything. His father's farm, the only inheritance he had, the only proof that his life had meant something. Elena went out into the field without a coat, feeling the cold bite her arms, and stood beside him, looking at the destroyed wheat. "We can replant some," she said, her voice firm with someone who has learned to survive bigger losses, "and sell what's left in bulk before the price drops any further." Caleb looked at her, surprised not by the advice, which was good, but by the "we." No one had said "we" to him in years. His father never had. The farm had always been a burden he carried alone. "This isn't your problem," he said, not cruelly, but with the old reflex of a man accustomed to carrying alone. "I live here," Elena replied, and there was something in her tone that admitted no argument. "So yes, it is." They worked side by side for weeks, replanting what they could, harvesting before dawn what couldn't be lost to a second frost, selling at the regional market with an urgency neither of them had felt in months. And in that shared work, something changed, silently but irreversibly. They stopped being two people coexisting under one roof, and became two people fighting for the same thing. One afternoon, exhausted, sitting on the porch with dirt-stained hands and aching shoulders, Elena laughed at something. A clumsy comment from Caleb about a chicken that had escaped 3 times that day. And he watched her laugh in a way he'd never seen her laugh before. Free, unguarded, without the weight of her history or his. And in that instant, Caleb understood something he'd been avoiding understanding for weeks. He wasn't protecting his farm. He was protecting his life with her in it. But that thought was accompanied by an old, deep fear. The fear of a man who had seen his father love so little that he hadn't even left words at death, only debts and conditions. What right did he, Caleb Whitfield, have to want more than arithmetic? What if he said it aloud and she simply didn't feel the same? Better the safe silence than the truth that could break it all. Thomas Hargrove chose that exact moment, because life has a particular cruelty to timing, to present a formal offer, not to Elena directly, but to her father, in a letter that arrived in Millbrook Hollow with the coldness of a contract. If Elena's marriage was, as rumored, one of convenience and not real affection, Thomas was willing to resolve the situation discreetly, offering to compensate Elena's father for the inconvenience of an annulled marriage in exchange for his daughter's hand. The letter first reached Elena's father's hands, and from there, of course, it arrived in Millbrook Hollow in the form of an unexpected visit. The man showed up at the farm on a Sunday afternoon with the same cold face Elena remembered from her childhood, and informed her, without preamble, that she had an opportunity to correct her situation. "He's a good match," her father said, sitting in Caleb's kitchen as if he had a right to be there. "Better than you deserve, given your history. You wouldn't be foolish enough to refuse it for loyalty to a paper arrangement." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not because of Thomas's offer, which meant nothing to her, but because of the ease with which her own father spoke of her life as if it were a transaction he had the right to renegotiate. Caleb, who had been in the stable and walked in just in time to hear the last words, felt something he hadn't felt in years: clear, unambiguous anger. "She is not yours to offer," he said, and his voice had an edge that surprised even Elena. "And this is not a paper arrangement. Not for me." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes entire rooms. Elena's father left that afternoon, furious but without further arguments, and Elena stood in the kitchen, looking at Caleb as if she were seeing him for the first time. "What did you mean?" she asked, almost breathless. "By it not being a paper arrangement." But before Caleb could answer, Banker Pruitt arrived again, with urgent news about the board, and the moment, like so many other important moments in life, was interrupted by life itself. What neither of them knew yet was that that unanswered question would hang between them for the most difficult days to come, and that the answer, when it finally arrived, would change everything. The bank's board met in mid-November, and though the replanted harvest had saved part of the farm, it wasn't enough to cover the full debt within the original deadline. Pruitt, with the cold courtesy of men who enjoy having power over other circumstances, gave Caleb 2 weeks to raise the rest, or the farm would be foreclosed. Caleb spent those 2 weeks in a state Elena had never seen him in, working to exhaustion, speaking even less than usual, carrying a weight that seemed to crush him from within. One night, late, she found him sitting alone in the stable, his head in his hands, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something akin to defeat in his posture. "Caleb," she said softly, sitting beside him on the hay. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to say," he replied without looking up. "I'm going to lose it. My father's farm, the only thing he left me, and I'm going to lose it anyway, married or not." "Then let's lose it together," Elena said, and the simplicity of the phrase stopped him cold. "But don't stop talking to me in the meantime. Don't push me away now." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his face surrendered to a truth he had been avoiding for months. "It's not just the farm I'm afraid of losing," he said, his voice low, almost broken. "I'm afraid of losing you, and that scares me more than the debt ever did." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. There it was, finally, the truth they had both been avoiding with almost religious care. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, her voice trembling between reproach and tenderness. Because we signed a paper that said this would be convenience, not feeling, Caleb said. And I was afraid that if I told the truth, you'd tell me the arrangement was exactly that, an arrangement, nothing more. Caleb, Elena said, and she moved close enough for him to see that her eyes were shining not with sadness, but with something more complicated and more alive. I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement months ago. When you started splitting firewood before I woke up, when you defended me to my father as if you had a right to, when I laughed with you on that porch and felt, for the first time in years, that I was in the right place. Then what is this? He asked, and the question carried the weight of a man asking permission to believe in something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for years. I don't know, Elena said honestly, but I know I don't want the paper to be the only thing that binds us. There was a silence then, long, dense, the kind of silence worth more than 100 well-constructed sentences. Caleb reached out his hand, slowly, giving Elena all the time in the world to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Their fingers intertwined in the cold hay of the stable, two hands that had worked the same land for months without knowing they were also building something more. I'm afraid I won't be able to save the farm, Caleb finally said. But for the first time in my life, I'm more afraid of losing you than of losing my father's land. And that tells me something I've been avoiding knowing for too long. What does it tell you? Elena asked, almost a whisper. That I'm not here for arithmetic anymore, he said. I'm here because I love you. No conditions, no paper to force it. I love you, Elena. The words weren't elegant. They weren't the kind of polished declaration from the books Elena had read as a child, dreaming of a love she never thought would come. They were clumsy, direct, spoken by a man unaccustomed to saying aloud what he felt. And for that very reason, they were perfect. I love you too, Elena said. And as she said it, she felt something loosen inside her, something she had been carrying since her previous engagement broke, since her father taught her that love was conditional. I've loved you for weeks, and I was afraid to say it because I thought it was just me, that you only saw this as convenience. Before he could respond, before there was time for the moment to fill with more words, Caleb kissed her, slowly, with the honest clumsiness of two people who had spent months learning to love each other without naming it. John Gottman, after 4 decades studying human relationships, discovered that couples who survive difficulties are not those who never fear speaking, but those who finally find the courage to speak the uncomfortable truth before silence becomes permanent distance. Caleb and Elena had spent months in that silence, and that night they finally decided not to stay there. When they broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against Caleb's, both breathing the same cold, stable air, and he said, with a small smile she had never seen on his face before, I can't promise you we'll save the farm, but I can promise you that, whatever happens, I won't face it without you. Then let's face it together, she said, like we've done everything else. Before continuing, I want to ask you something. From which country are you joining us today? Write it in the comments. I love to know where this story comes from. The days that followed had a different texture. The work was still hard. The debt still hung over them like a constant shadow. But now they faced it as what they truly were, a team, not an arrangement. Caleb began to touch her with a new naturalness, a hand on her lower back as he passed behind her in the kitchen, fingers brushing hers as they passed a coffee cup. Elena, for her part, stopped pretending she didn't seek out those moments, that she didn't anticipate them with an expectation she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. A week before the bank's deadline, Elena had an idea that would change everything. She remembered her great-aunt, before she died, had mentioned a small investment in a regional transport company, papers no one had reviewed amidst the chaos of inheritance debts. They spent 2 days sifting through every document of the late aunt and finally found an almost forgotten stock certificate that, sold in time, covered exactly the difference Caleb needed to satisfy the bank's board. It wasn't a romantic miracle of the kind found in fairy tales. It was the result of 2 people working together, looking at every corner of their shared life with the same care they had begun to look at each other. Pruitt, when he received the full payment just before the deadline, couldn't hide a certain professional disappointment, which, for Caleb, was almost as satisfying as saving the farm itself. That night, to celebrate, there was no grand party or speeches. They just had dinner together, as always. But this time Caleb sat closer to her at the table, and when they finished eating, instead of getting up to work, he stayed. He just stayed, looking at her, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who finally understood that the true value of a farm wasn't in the land, but in who shared it with you. "We have to get married again," Elena said suddenly, a week later, as they both mended the garden fence that the autumn had battered. Caleb stopped, hammer halfway. "What do you mean? We're already married." "On paper," she said, and she smiled in that way he had learned to long for. "I want to do it again. I want to say the words knowing what they mean this time." So, on a cold December afternoon, with barely a handful of neighbors present, Reverend Holt, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew something the others didn't when he joined them that first time, Caleb and Elena spoke their vows again. Not as a marriage of convenience, but as a conscious choice, made by 2 people who had learned through early frost and shared debt and silences that finally broke that true love rarely arrives announced. Sometimes it arrives disguised as need and stays, if you're lucky, long after the original need has disappeared. They built a life together the way real lives are built, not with grand gestures, but with the slow accumulation of thousands of small ones. Caleb learned to say what he felt without being asked, though he never stopped being a man of few words. Elena learned to trust again, to let someone care for her without suspecting a trap behind every kindness. They expanded the farm 2 years later, buying the adjoining land with the profits from a harvest that, this time, didn't have to be saved from any frost. Elena taught the seasonal workers' children to read on winter afternoons, a custom that began almost by accident and ended up becoming the town's small school. Caleb, the man who once had no time for courtship, became the kind of husband who left clumsy but sincere notes in the kitchen when he left before dawn, simply so she would know, upon waking, that she had been thought of. 22 years later, on a late summer afternoon, a woman with silver hair sits on the same porch where she once laughed at an escaped chicken, watching a man with even more calloused hands teach a grandson how to repair a fence. The sun falls on the fields the same way it fell that first afternoon, golden and slow, and the sound of the nearby creek mixes with the laughter of a child who doesn't quite understand why his grandfather smiles so much while he works. Elena watches Caleb look up, as he always does, as he has done for 22 years, to find her watching him from the porch. And in that silent exchange, that look that no longer needs words because it has said everything it needed to say thousands of times over the years, There is something that no paper signed that first winter could ever have predicted. In some drawer of the house, kept among old documents, that first marriage contract still exists. The signatures a little faded by time, the edges softened from being folded and put away again so many times. Elena finds it sometimes, by accident, while looking for something else, and each time she does, she smiles in the same way. Not because the paper means little, but because she knows, with the quiet certainty of years lived, that that document was only the beginning of something neither of them knew they were signing that day. They didn't sign an arrangement. They signed, without knowing it yet, the first day of the rest of their lives. And perhaps that is the most honest truth this story can offer you. That love doesn't always arrive announced with fireworks or perfect words. Sometimes it arrives disguised as need, as convenience, as a paper signed out of desperation. But if you have the patience to stay, if you have the courage to truly look at the person in front of you, the paper can become something much greater than either of you imagined. It can become a lifetime.